Hi, Drawing 2 students. So we're going to talk about atmospheric perspective this week, and then we're also going to talk about how to use dry pastels. So last week was linear perspective. We were focused on horizon lines and lines that recede, and now we're going to look at how we can use color to create the illusion of depth in a different way. So this is a great photograph that illustrates the illusion of atmospheric perspective, but we're going to see lots more. So here's what I don't want. When we introduce color, often kids start to, or students start to like flatten things out and just go back to what they know. We're going to try and avoid this. This image has no depth or very little depth, only where those two mountains happen to overlap, and that's it. So we're going to avoid this scenario. This is a little more what I would like to get us to. This is a piece created by a student from a story that he was reading. So it illustrates the scene. If you notice, the background becomes more blurry and less detailed in the distance. The things in the foreground are very detailed. So what creates this illusion of space? So we already know some of the things that create the illusion of space. Overlapping things, changing size, big comes forward, small goes back. Placing things at the bottom of the page, it appears closer. If it's at the top of the page, it appears farther away. And linear perspective, the thing we practiced last week. Now, what else creates depth? Atmospheric perspective. So it's the change in values and the clarity of the details in the image. What happens in the atmosphere is the moisture in the atmosphere basically clouds our view of things in the distance. So just a quick review what these basic ideas are: overlapping, right? Stacking things. Size change, big is forward, small recedes, placement, bottom and top, and then linear perspective, using any converging or receding lines. So here's a sketch that shows you all three parts of a landscape: foreground, middle ground, background. The foreground has the most detail and the most contrast. The middle ground has less detail, it's smaller, it has less contrast, and then the background has very little contrast and is just very, very little detail. So the Mona Lisa is a classic painting. It's probably one of the most well-known in the entire world. The part of it that typically gets neglected is the beautiful atmospheric perspective in the background, the way the landscape just disappears into the sky. Something to notice. Lots of other artists are good at using atmospheric perspective. This is an M.C. Escher piece. Lots of interesting detail, and this is linear perspective in the foreground being used, right? But as we get to the background, you see the atmospheric fades. So this very distant background has very little detail. In contrast, the foreground has extreme detail. Comic book artists use this a lot. Linear perspective combined with atmospheric perspective. So the change here you can see. Here's another piece that shows kind of a dramatic difference between the sharp, clear edges of the silhouettes in the foreground against the blurry outline of the city in the background. You can hardly see the edge of where things are stopping and starting. Here's a piece that shows an underwater scene using that same idea: clarity in the front and contrast. Distant images or distant objects are very faded and light. Same thing happening here in this painting. And this is a nice one because it shows an unusual viewpoint. So you can see the change from this hard, sharp contrast in the front to very distant background spaces. So how does this work? Color and perspective. So color, if you think about the atmosphere, the highest parts of the atmosphere are the coldest as the atmosphere lowers, right? As it gets closer to the earth, it becomes warmer. So colors typically go from cool at the top of your landscape or cityscape to warm near the horizon. And the same thing is true in your foreground to your background. Warm colors nearest you, coolest colors recede. So what this looks like typically is that when you get to the horizon line in the back of your picture, a lot of the colors are very similar. There isn't a lot of dramatic contrast, but in the foreground you'll see more dramatic contrast and change. You would also see a lot more detail. So here's the practice that I'm going to guide you through. You're going to create this with dry pastels. But before you do this one, I'd actually like you to draw this peach to get used to mixing dry pastels. If you haven't used them before, or if you've never used them at all, you're going to do this one first. And after that, we'll go on to this. So please exit this lecture and then open up your peach practice and complete that, and then come back and complete the atmosphere perspective practice. And both of these will be turned in to the same assignment. Okay, great. Good luck.